Tonight, we're settling into one of those stories that feels like it should have been a grand political thriller, but actually ends up being more like a very long family squabble with a lot of denial, medical weirdness, and a whole lot of people pretending things weren't as bad as they obviously were. So dim the lights, pull up a blanket, get comfortable, because tonight we're going to talk about cover-ups. Not the juicy modern ones about billionaires and conspiracy theories. No, we're going old school. Back when kings, queens, and emperors thought the best way to keep power was to quietly sweep their embarrassing secrets under the nearest Persian carpet and hope no one noticed. Spoiler, people noticed. And we're starting with one of the greatest royal cover-ups in history. A saga so slow, so sad, and so potato-shaped that it makes you wonder how on earth anyone managed to pretend otherwise for so long. I'm talking about the Habsburg dynasty. Yes, those Habsburgs. The human embodiment of what happens when your family tree is less of a tree and more of a tangled root system. The Habsburg problem now. The Habsburgs were a big deal. For centuries, they sat on the thrones of Spain, Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, and pretty much every corner of Europe that had a castle worth bragging about. They loved power, they loved titles, and most of all, they loved marrying each other. Not in a metaphorical sense. I mean literally. Cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, all in the name of keeping the family fortune nice and tidy. Because nothing says effective empire management like genetic roulette, the result. A dynasty with more money and castles than sense, and a family portrait gallery that slowly turned into a visual cautionary tale about why variety in the gene pool is generally a good idea. But here's the cover-up part. Despite centuries of interesting genetics, the Habsburgs desperately tried to maintain the illusion that everything was fine, totally normal, perfectly healthy. Just your average family with a jawline so big it could double as a bookshelf. And at the center of this long, slow unraveling stands one man, the ultimate product of centuries of dynastic micromanagement. King Charles II of Spain, enter Charles. Charles was born in 1661, and from the very beginning, things didn't look great. His parents were Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, which sounds fine, until you realize Mariana was actually Philip's niece. Yes, niece. Because why not double down on the whole family loop thing? So Charles entered the world with the odds stacked against him. And when I say stacked, I mean it in the same way a Jenga tower looks stacked. When it's about to collapse, contemporary accounts describe baby Charles as sickly, small, and unable to walk or talk properly, until he was nearly 4. He didn't learn to speak in full sentences until he was 8. His teeth were so misaligned from the famous Habsburg jaw that chewing food was basically a group project between him and his kitchen staff. And yet here's the cover-up part. Everyone at the Spanish court pretended like everything was completely fine, perfectly normal. Nothing to see here. Because acknowledging Charles's condition meant admitting that maybe, just maybe, centuries of cousin-and-cousin matrimony wasn't the best long-term health strategy. The official line, so the court's official story was that Charles was delicate, fragile, sensitive, you know. All the vague words people use when they don't want to say, this child cannot rule the continent. Ambassadors wrote back to their home countries with coded descriptions. Some would politely say the king was not of great intelligence. Others were less polite and described him as imbecilic, which, for 17th century diplomats, is about as savage as it gets. But in Spain, silence. Everyone kept insisting Charles was the rightful king, destined for greatness. The Habsburg court poured resources into tutors, physicians, priests, exorcists, name it. If it could possibly make Charles seem like a functioning monarch, they tried it. Of course, none of it worked. But appearances had to be maintained. That's what dynasties do best. Deny, delay, and cover up. Everyday struggles. So what was it actually like being Charles II? Well, imagine being the king of one of the richest empires in the world. But you can't chew food properly. You can barely string sentences together. And you spend half your life bedridden with mystery illnesses. Charles was carried around the palace like a fragile antique vase. Every cough was treated as a national crisis. His mother Mariana basically ruled on his behalf for decades, while everyone else whispered about when Spain would finally collapse under its own genetic weight. But Charles, bless him, kept trying. He attended councils. He listened to advisors. He even got married twice. First to Marie-Louise of Orleans, niece of Louis XIV, the French Sun King, and later to Maria Anna of Neuburg. Both marriages were supposed to secure heirs and keep the dynasty alive. But Charles never had children. The medical consensus now is that he was sterile. Another gift of the Habsburg family tree. Still, the Spanish court kept up the cover. Every year that passed without an heir was blamed on the wives. First wife to French, second wife to German. Definitely not the king's problem. No way. The religious angle, because this was 17th century Spain. The cover-up wasn't just medical or political. It was also spiritual. Charles's struggles were often framed as the result of curses, witchcraft, or divine punishment. His court physicians and confessors sometimes claimed he was bewitched, which honestly makes sense, because he's cursed sounds a lot better. Then our royal gene pool is about as diverse as a puddle. There are even reports that exorcisms were performed on Charles, multiple times. He was made to drink holy water, touch relics, and sit through elaborate rituals to drive out supposed demons. Of course, none of that helped either, but again it shifted the blame away from the dynasty's choices. The story wasn't we. Married cousins for 200 years straight. The story was Satan's after our king. The slow collapse by the late 1690s. Spain was falling apart right alongside Charles. The empire was broke, exhausted from wars, and held together mostly by inertia. And Charles himself was fading fast. Ambassadors at the time described him as a walking skeleton. His hair fell out. His skin turned pale. He suffered from seizures. Some accounts say he drooled constantly and struggled to stay awake during meetings. But still, the cover-up continued. Official portraits tried to make him look regal. Ceremonies were staged to give the impression of control. And the Spanish court insisted he was still perfectly capable of ruling. Behind the scenes, of course, everyone was just waiting for the inevitable. The man was not going to produce an heir, and when he died, the whole Habsburg grip on Spain was going to collapse with him. The death of the dynasty Charles II died in 1700 at the age of 38, which, considering his health, was honestly longer than anyone expected. His death marked the end of the Spanish Habsburg line. After centuries of inbreeding, power hoarding, and cover-ups, the dynasty simply ran out of viable heirs. The Spanish crown passed to the Bourbons, sparking the War of Spanish Succession. But in Spain, the cover-up continued even in death. Official reports called him a pious and noble king. Portraits showed him as dignified. The reality that he was a tragic product of dynastic obsession, was quietly brushed aside. It wasn't until much later, when historians dug into the family tree, that the full picture emerged. And what a picture it is, the greatest cover-up. So why call this one of the greatest cover-ups on Earth? Because for nearly 4 decades, an entire empire pretended its king was fine, when everyone knew he wasn't. It wasn't a cover-up in the sense of hiding a crime or a scandal. It was bigger than that. It was a cover-up of reality itself, a stubborn refusal to admit that centuries of cousin marriages had finally caught up with them. Charles II became less of a monarch and more of a living symbol, a reminder of what happens when power is valued over practicality, and when appearances matter more than truth. And the empire held that cover story right up until the very end. The king who should have stayed in bed. So we just left Spain, where Charles II spent his life as the fragile poster child for centuries of Habsburg family recycling. But don't worry, we're not done with royal denial just yet. Let's gently sail over to England, because in the 15th century, England had a king whose reign was less about ruling and more about everyone around him, desperately pretending things were under control. His name was Henry VI. And if Charles II of Spain was the genetic cover-up, Henry VI was the mental health cover-up. A child king nobody wanted, Henry VI was born in 1421, the only son of Henry V, and yes, that's the Henry V, the heroic warrior. King who crushed the French at Agincourt, and basically lived his life like a Shakespearean monologue. Unfortunately, Henry V died suddenly in 1422, which meant his baby son, not even 1 year old, became King of England. And not just King of England, thanks to the whole 100 Years' War situation. He was also declared King of France. So here's Henry VI, drooling in his cradle, wearing a crown way too big for his head, technically ruling 2 kingdoms at once, a toddler monarch. Because history loves a bad idea. Obviously, he didn't actually govern anything as a child. Regents and protectors handled affairs while Henry grew up. The official story was that young Henry would one day follow in his father's footsteps and become another warrior king. Bold, fierce, charismatic. Spoiler, he did not. Not exactly king material from a young age, Henry VI showed signs that he was different. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't commanding. He wasn't even particularly interested in ruling. Instead, he was quiet, timid, devoutly religious. He liked prayer, reading, and hanging out with his tutors more than jousts or war councils. Sounds wholesome, right? Unfortunately, in 15th England, quiet and bookish was basically the worst possible personality for a king. People expected their monarch to lead armies, crush rebellions, and generally stomp around in armor, looking heroic. Henry, meanwhile, was more likely to suggest everyone stop fighting and say a rosary together. The cover-up began early. Courtiers and chroniclers kept trying to spin his gentle personality as a sign of piety, wisdom, or humility, which is polite. Code 4, he's not cut out for this, but please don't panic. The first cracks show by his teens and 20s. Henry's problems became harder to ignore. While other kings his age were charging into battle, Henry was drifting. He avoided conflict. He struggled to make decisions. He leaned heavily on advisors, many of them unpopular or corrupt. And then there was the 100 Years' War, the war his father had left him as an awkward inheritance. Henry VI wanted peace, which is nice in theory. In practice, it meant signing disastrous treaties that gave away huge swaths of territory in France. This was not popular. Imagine losing land your father had fought tooth and nail for, all because your son preferred not to argue. That was Henry VI in a nutshell. The official line: Henry was merciful. Too merciful, perhaps, but still wise. The unofficial whisper: he was incompetent marriage and meltdowns to strengthen his position. Henry married Margaret of Anjou in 1445. She was only 15. But unlike her husband, Margaret was tough as nails, intelligent, fierce, politically ambitious, basically everything. Henry wasn't, which might have worked out if Henry had been stable. But in 1453, everything changed. That year, Henry VI suffered what we'd now call a complete mental breakdown. Contemporary sources describe him falling into a catatonic state. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He didn't recognize people. He just sat there for over a year. Imagine the scene: England's king, basically unresponsive, while nobles are circling like sharks. But here's the thing, no one wanted to admit it, because acknowledging that the king was mentally broken meant acknowledging the kingdom itself was broken. So the cover-up kicked in. Courtiers insisted Henry just needed rest. Advisors quietly handled business. Public announcements were vague. To the outside world, the king was indisposed. Behind the scenes, Margaret of Anjou tried to hold everything together with sheer force of will. The Wars of the Roses begin, of course. You can only hide a royal breakdown for so long. Rival factions began maneuvering for power. Chief among them was Richard, Duke of York. He argued that with the king incapacitated, someone needed to step in as protector of the realm. Margaret, naturally, disagreed. She wanted power for herself and her newborn son, Edward of Westminster. Thus began the long, bloody civil conflict known as the Wars of the Roses. Two branches of the royal family, Lancaster, Henry's side, and York, clashing over who should actually run England, while Henry sat quietly in the background, sometimes catatonic, sometimes vaguely functional, but never truly in control. And through it all, the cover-up continued. Chronicles painted Henry as saintly, misunderstood, or unfairly manipulated. Rarely did anyone say the obvious. The man was simply unfit to rule, the king who preferred monks to ministers. When Henry wasn't catatonic, he still wasn't exactly inspiring confidence. Instead of councils and campaigns, he preferred religious devotion. He loved patronizing monasteries, founding colleges, and spending hours in prayer. Kingly business, not so much. He actually founded Eton College, which still exists today. So yes, if you ever wonder why Britain's elite schools have such a long history, you can thank Henry VI, though he probably thought he was building a big monastery with extra homework. The irony is that Henry might have been perfectly happy as a monk, a quiet life of prayer, study, and contemplation, but as king, his gentle nature became a liability that the kingdom couldn't afford. Downfall and depositioned by the 1460s. The Wars of the Roses were in full swing. The Duke of York and his allies gained momentum. Henry's own supporters dwindled. Margaret of Anjou kept fighting tooth and nail, but her husband was no help. In 1461, Henry VI was officially deposed. The crown went to Edward IV, son of the Duke of York. Henry and his family went into hiding. The official story, of course, was that Henry was still king in God's eyes, a rightful ruler cruelly usurped. The unofficial reality, pretty much everyone knew Henry was a disaster as monarch. The return. Briefly, but wait, Because this is England, nothing is ever simple. In 1470, Henry was briefly restored to the throne during a rebellion against Edward IV. Did he suddenly recover and take charge? Of course not. Witnesses said he looked dazed, thin, and confused. He basically shuffled back onto the throne like someone who had wandered into the wrong room at a party. Within a year, Edward IV returned, crushed the rebellion, and put Henry back in the Tower of London. This time, for good. The end of the line in 1471, Henry VI died in captivity. The official story was that he died of melancholy, which is a very medieval way of saying sadness. The unofficial, but widely accepted version, he was quietly murdered, probably on Edward IV's orders. After all, a living rival king is a problem. A dead one is much more convenient. But even in death, the cover-up lingered. Chroniclers loyal to Lancaster portrayed Henry as a saintly martyr. Stories spread of miracles at his tomb. Pilgrims came to pray. The narrative shifted from weak king to holy victim. The truth that he was a deeply unfit ruler whose reign nearly destroyed England was glossed over for centuries. Another great cover-up. So, why does Henry VI deserve a spot alongside Charles II of Spain in the pantheon of great royal cover-ups? Because for his entire life, everyone around him tried desperately to maintain the illusion that England had a functioning king, when he was too timid to rule. They called it piety. When he gave away French territory, they called it mercy. When he sat in a catatonic state for over a year, they called it a temporary illness. The reality that Henry was simply incapable of being king was quietly buried under layers of spin, prayer, and denial. It didn't save his dynasty, but it did give England one of the strangest, saddest reigns in its history. The Sun King and the shadows he cast so far, we've looked at Spain's Charles II, the human embodiment of please don't marry your cousin, and England's Henry VI, the king who probably would have been happier in a monastery than on a throne. Both lived their lives wrapped in layers of denial and spin. But now, let's slide gracefully into France. Because if there's one dynasty that understood appearances in the importance of covering up flaws, it was the Bourbons. And at the very center of it all was Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, the man who invented the PR King Louis XIV, was born in 1638 and became king in 1643 at the age of 4. That's right, another child king. Because apparently, in early modern Europe, if your ruler could form full sentences before they could form a foreign policy, you were doing it wrong. But Louis had an advantage. People around him who were very, very good at spinning narratives. From early on, his reign was built around an image. Louis wasn't just a king, he was the king, glorious, divine, radiant, like the sun. Of course, the reality was a little different. Louis had insecurities, health issues, and a personal life that was basically a soap opera. But you'd never know that if you just looked at the propaganda machine he built. Versailles itself was one giant cover-up, a palace so dazzling that it distracted people from the cracks beneath the gold leaf. The constant ceremonies, the elaborate court life fit was all designed to control the nobility, hide the king's flaws, and keep everyone focused on the show. The health nobody talked about. Now, Louis XIV projected strength and majesty. But behind the velvet curtains, he had his share of less than sun-like problems. For starters, his teeth, or rather, his lack of them. By his mid-40s, Louis had basically no teeth left. He suffered from constant abscesses, infections, and halitosis. So bad that courtiers reportedly dreaded standing near him, but of course, no one dared mention it. The official line was that the king was vigorous, radiant, chosen by God. The reality was that he probably smelled like a decomposing compost heap during audiences. And then there was his famously botched surgery in 1686. Louis developed a massive anal fistulae. You heard that right hand required a highly publicized surgical procedure. Because of course, when you're the Sun King, even your medical emergencies have to be turned into a national spectacle. The court physicians staged the operation as a triumph. Pamphlets were printed, poets wrote verses. It became a public relations moment, with the spin being, see, even the king suffers, but he endures it heroically. The reality, he probably just barely survived having his backside carved open without anesthesia. But again, cover it up with poetry, and voila, national unity. The family drama. Louis's personal life was equally messy. He had a whole collection of mistresses, illegitimate children, and scandals. Some mistresses wielded enormous political influence. Others were kept more discreet. But the cover-up was always the same. Louis was the model of Catholic kingship, a beacon of morality. The official portraits never showed him sneaking down Versailles' endless hallways to visit yet another lady-in-waiting. Even when he secretly married his longtime mistress, Madame de Maintenon, after the death of his queen, it was presented as an act of piety and devotion. Quietly brushed under the rug was the fact that he'd fathered at least a dozen illegitimate children and spent decades juggling romances like a 17th century soap opera lead. But of course, the Sun King could do no wrong, at least not officially. The wars nobody could afford. Then there's the matter of war. Louis XIV spent much of his reign fighting expensive, exhausting conflicts. The War of Devolution, the Franco-Dutch War, the War of the Spanish Succession, the official story. These wars were glorious campaigns, proving France's might. The reality, they drained the treasury, bled the population, and left peasants starving while Versailles glittered ever brighter. The cover-up here was Versailles itself. The endless balls, the fountains, the operas, it was all distraction. While the countryside reeled under taxes and famine, the nobility danced in gilded halls and pretended nothing was wrong. Louis himself bought into the illusion. He genuinely believed that by controlling the image, he controlled reality. And for a while, he was right. The final years, but even the Sun King couldn't outshine death. By the end of his 72-year reign, Louis XIV was a frail, aging man, racked with gangrene. He lost his heir, his grandson, and several great-grandchildren in quick succession. The carefully managed illusion of a thriving dynasty began to crack, and yet until his last breath, the cover-up continued. He was portrayed as serene, godlike, in perfect control. Even as his leg rotted beneath him, the official narrative was that France's greatest monarch was departing with dignity. The truth that his wars had bankrupted the state and his family line was in tatters was quietly set aside. After the son, when Louis XIV died in 1715, his great-grandson, a child of just 5 years, inherited the throne as Louis XV. And here's where the cover-up tradition really carried on. Because if the Sun King was the master of appearances, his successors became the masters of denial. Louis XV, nicknamed the Well-Beloved, had his own share of scandals, most notably an endless parade of mistresses that made even his great-grandfather look restrained, the official spin. He was charming, beloved, a man of the people. The reality, the people despised him. Famines raged. Taxes climbed. Corruption flourished. But at Versailles, the parties never stopped. The cover-up was a way of life, and by the time Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette came along, the illusion had become impossible to sustain. Their reign collapsed not because of one single mistake, but because centuries of denial had built up a debt that no amount of diamonds, wigs, or parties could cover. The revolution wasn't just about bread or taxes, it was about the end of the greatest, longest-running cover-up in French history. The idea that the monarchy was untouchable. Why the Bourbons belong here so? Why include the Bourbons in our sleepy tours of royal cover-ups? Because few dynasties understood better that power isn't just about armies or taxes. It's about perception, about weaving a story so dazzling that people stop noticing the cracks underneath. Louis XIV turned his very body disease surgeries, flaws into part of the performance. His successors tried to keep the act going, even as the script fell apart. And for a long time, it worked. But eventually, reality wins. Versailles couldn't keep the truth hidden forever. The Romanovs and the art of pretending. So far, we've met Spain's Charles II, who was basically a fragile medical report in royal clothing. England's Henry VI, the monk who accidentally got handed a crown. And the Bourbons, who built an entire palace just to distract everyone from the fact that France was broke. Now, let's glide over to Russia. A land of snow, palaces, and more vodka than common sense. Here, the Romanov dynasty ruled for more than 300 years, and throughout their history, they mastered the fine art of covering things up. Scandals, illnesses, failures, it was all swept under fur rugs and buried beneath layers of ceremony. And no story illustrates this better than the late Romanovs. The ones who stared down the 20th century with the confidence of people still living in the 18th. The glittering illusion for much of the 19th century, the Romanovs projected an image of unstoppable might. They styled themselves as rulers, the little fathers of their people. St. Petersburg glimmered with palaces. The Winter Palace was filled with chandeliers, ballrooms, and the constant hum of court gossip. But behind the scenes, things weren't quite so shiny. Russia was lagging behind industrially. Serfdom had left its population deeply impoverished. Political repression was everywhere, and revolutionary groups were growing bolder. The cover-up, the Romanovs insisted everything was fine. Official portraits showed serene rulers, guardians of a happy people. Court rituals emphasized stability, and anyone who suggested otherwise was, well, invited to take a very long holiday in Siberia. Enter Nicholas I, which brings us to Nicholas II, the last Romanov Tsar. Nicholas was born in 1868 and became emperor in 1894. On paper, he looked like a safe choice. Tall, neat beard, handsome, in uniform. But, in reality, he was completely unprepared. He once admitted to a relative that he never wanted to be Tsar and had no idea how to rule. Not exactly reassuring words from the man in charge of the largest country on earth. But the cover-up machine went into overdrive. Nicholas was presented as a strong, steady hand, the divine protector of Russia. The reality that he was timid, indecisive, and constantly bullied by stronger personalities was carefully hidden. Alexandra and the family, Brand Nicholas, married Alexandra of Hesse, a German princess. She was intelligent and devoted, but also deeply insecure and intensely religious. Together, they cultivated the image of the perfect royal family. Loving parents, pious rulers, deeply moral people. And in many ways, that was true. Nicholas adored Alexandra. They doted on their children. Compared to many monarchs, their family life was unusually warm. But here's where the greatest cover-up of their dynasty begins. The haemophilia's secret. Nicholas and Alexandra had 4 daughters before finally producing a son, Alexia, in 1904, the long-awaited heir, the boy who would continue the Romanov line. There was just one problem. Alexei had haemophilia, a genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. Even a small injury could be life-threatening. This was devastating. The future of the dynasty rested on a boy who could bleed to death from a bruise. So, naturally, the Romanovs did what royals always do. They covered it up. To the public, Alexei was a healthy, vibrant child. Official photos showed him smiling in sailor suits, perched happily beside his sisters. But behind palace walls, he was constantly in danger, kept under watch, protected from rough play, and subject to frantic medical interventions whenever he fell ill. Only a small circle of family and trusted advisors knew the truth. To admit otherwise would have been to admit weakness at the very heart of the monarchy. Rasputin arrived. Then came Rasputin. Grigory Rasputin was a Siberian peasant, mystic, and all-around questionable character. He had a knack for convincing people he could heal. And somehow, he managed to win Alexandra's trust after reportedly helping Alexei recover from a particularly bad episode. Was it prayer, hypnosis, sheer coincidence? No one really knows, but Alexandra became convinced Rasputin was the only thing keeping her son alive. Cue another massive cover-up. Because from the outside, Rasputin was not ideal. He was unkempt, rumored to be drunk half the time, and the subject of endless scandals involving women. Having him around the royal children did not look good, but the Romanovs hid it. They insisted Rasputin was a holy man, unfairly slandered. In reality, he had enormous influence over Alexandra, who in turn pushed Nicholas to listen to him, to the public. Rasputin became a symbol of everything wrong with the monarchy. But the court kept up the facade. The cracks widened as Russia stumbled. Into the 20th century, cracks in the cover-up became harder to hide. The disastrous Russo-Japanese War in 1904, the Bloody Sunday Massacre in 1905, the endless political unrest. Through it all, Nicholas and Alexandra clung to the image of a divinely chosen family. They doubled down on ceremony, prayer, and secrecy. Even as the empire shook, they insisted nothing was wrong. The official narrative was one of strength and faith. The reality was that Russia was a powder keg, and the Tsar was holding the match. Upside down, the revolution looms by the time World War I arrived. The illusion was crumbling. Nicholas took personal command of the army, despite having no military talent. Losses piled up. Soldiers mutinied. The home front starved. And back in Petrograd, Alexandra and Rasputin ran the government like a badly scripted play. Ministers were hired and fired on Rasputin's whims. Rumors flew of treason, of German spies in the palace, of corruption at every level. The cover-up could no longer hold. People could see the chaos for themselves. The Falin, March 1917, the inevitable happened. Revolution swept through Russia. Nicholas was forced to abdicate. The Romanovs were placed under house arrest. Even then, the cover-up lingered. The family believed they might be exiled, may be allowed to live quietly abroad. Alexandra clung to hope that foreign relatives would intervene. The reality that they were living on borrowed time was too much to face. And in July 1918, the Romanovs were executed. Aftermath and myths, but the cover-up didn't end there. For decades, stories circulated that some of the Romanovs had survived. Anastasia, especially, became the subject of endless myths, imposters, and romantic tales. The Soviet government, meanwhile, covered up the details of the execution for years. It wasn't until the 1990s that the full truth came out, with DNA evidence confirming the family's fate. So even in death, the Romanovs remained wrapped in layers of denial, secrecy, and myth-making. Why the Romanovs belong here? The cover-up wasn't just about one frail child or one mystic advisor. It was about an entire system built on illusion. A belief that if you projected enough divine light, people wouldn't notice the cracks in the throne. It worked until it didn't. And when the cover finally tore open, it wasn't just a dynasty that fell. It was an entire empire. The Habsburgs, Vienna, edition we've seen the Spanish Habsburgs collapse under the weight of their own DNA. England's Henry VI melt into melancholy. France's Bourbons dance until the floor gave out, and Russia's Romanovs pray their way into a firing squad. Now, let's circle back to Vienna, because the Austrian branch of the Habsburg family was still alive, well and very busy pretending that everything was fine. Long after it very clearly wasn't, the model dynasty. Spain's Habsburgs fizzled out with Charles II. Austria's branch took over as the family's main act. They were powerful, Catholic, and absurdly proud of their long, tangled family tree. But behind all the pomp and Baroque facades, the same issues kept creeping in. Illness, dysfunction, melancholy, and a desperate insistence that none of it mattered. Because, well, Habsburgs don't fail, at least. Not in public. Empress Maria Theresa. Holding it together, let's start with Maria Theresa, the only female ruler of the Habsburg dominions. She took the throne in 1740 after her father, Emperor Charles VI, died without a male heir. Now, technically women weren't supposed to rule, but Charles VI had spent years begging Europe to accept what he called the pragmatic sanction, basically. A legal note saying, "Please don't invade when my daughter takes over." Of course, the moment he died, everyone invaded anyway. Welcome to the War of the Austrian Succession. Maria Theresa's reign was presented as strong, maternal, divinely sanctioned. The cover-up, she was constantly scrambling to hold her empire. Together, patching holes with diplomacy and marriages. And oh, the marriages. She had 16 children, yes, 16, and used them like chess pieces to secure alliances. One daughter, Maria Antonia, would eventually become Marie Antoinette of France, and we all know how that turned out. On paper, Maria Theresa was the model of imperial motherhood. In reality, her dynasty was increasingly fragile, propped up by carefully staged images of harmony and virtue. Franz, Joseph, and Sisi, the Instagram couple of the 19th century. Fast forward a century, and we meet Emperor Franz Joseph and his glamorous wife, Empress Elizabeth, better known as Sisi. Franz Joseph came to the throne in 1848, during the revolutionary upheavals sweeping Europe. His reign was presented as a rock of stability, an empire standing firm while everyone else dabbled in liberalism and nationalism. Enter Sisi. She married Franz Joseph at just 16. And from the start, she was marketed as the fairy tale empress. Beautiful, fashionable, adored. Think of her as the 19th century version of a celebrity influencer, but with bigger dresses. But of course, reality was different. Their marriage was deeply unhappy. Franz Joseph was dutiful but cold. Sissy, meanwhile, struggled with depression, eating disorders, and a deep dislike of court life. She spent much of her life traveling abroad, away from Vienna, writing melancholy poetry about how trapped she felt. The cover-up. Official portraits showed them as the perfect imperial couple. He, the stern father of the empire. She, the radiant empress. In truth, they barely spent time together. The crown prince, who never was, and then came their son, Crown Prince Rudolph. If Charles II of Spain was the genetic dead end, Rudolph was the psychological one. Rudolph was groomed to inherit the throne. But he suffered from severe depression, unstable moods, and a tendency toward reckless behavior. In 1889, he was found dead at Merling, his hunting lodge, alongside his young mistress, Baroness Mary Wetzera. Officially, it was declared a suicide pact. Unofficially, the Habsburg court went into overdrive, trying to cover up the scandal. At first, they claimed it was an accident. Then, they hinted at poison. Eventually, the Vatican had to be persuaded to allow a Christian burial, which normally would have been denied for suicide. The Merling incident became one of the biggest royal scandals of the 19th century. But within Vienna, the official narrative was carefully managed. The tragedy was framed as a moment of personal misfortune, not evidence of dynastic instability. The truth that the heir to the throne had spiraled into despair and died in a messy scandal was smoothed over, because admitting otherwise would have meant confronting the fact that the dynasty was rotting from within. Franz Ferdinand. Another shot at stability after Rudolph's death. The next heir was Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Yes, the same Franz Ferdinand whose assassination in 1914 sparked World War I. Franz Ferdinand's personal life was another cover-up waiting to happen. He fell in love with Sophie Chotek, a lady-in-waiting who was considered far below his station. Their marriage was allowed only if their children were excluded from succession. The official line was that the couple was accepted, if not celebrated. In reality, Sophie was treated with open disdain at court. She couldn't sit beside her husband at official dinners, couldn't walk with him in processions, and was constantly reminded that she was lesser. The empire pretended this was all fine, a minor issue, but the hostility was so obvious that when the couple visited Sarajevo in 1914, their security was laughably poor. And when they were assassinated, the empire suddenly had a problem much bigger than snubs at dinner parties. The cover-up here wasn't just about one marriage. It was about the entire illusion that the Habsburg monarchy was stable. In truth, it was brittle, hollowed out, and held together by denial. The old Emperor Franz Joseph himself lived to be 86. By the time of his death in 1916, he had reigned for 68 years. To his subjects, he was a symbol of endurance. The empire's grandfather, the man who had always been there. But behind the symbol, Franz Joseph was exhausted. He had endured revolutions, defeats, family tragedies, and the slow disintegration of his empire. His last years were spent propping up a monarchy that everyone knew was failing. Yet the cover-up persisted. His death was framed as the peaceful end of a glorious reign. The truth that the empire was already collapsing under the weight of world War I was politely left out of the official narrative. The end of the Habsburg story 2 years later. In 1918, the Austro-Hungarian Empire finally fell apart. Franz Joseph's grandnephew, Karl I, was the last emperor. He tried to spin himself as a reformer, a peacemaker, a man who could save the dynasty. The reality, he had no chance. The empire was already disintegrating along nationalist lines. By the end of the war, Karl was forced into exile. He spent the rest of his life insisting he was still the rightful emperor, a cover-up of his own, until his death in 1922. Why the Austrian Habsburgs belong here? The Austrian Habsburgs were masters of the long-term cover-up. They polished their image until it gleamed, even as their heirs self-destructed. Their marriages cracked, and their empire crumbled. Maria Theresa sold herself as the perfect mother. Franz Joseph and Sissi were sold as the perfect couple. Rudolf was supposed to be the perfect heir. Franz Ferdinand, the perfect reformer. Karl, the perfect peacemaker. None of it was true. But the dynasty survived as long as it did because the illusion was powerful until, as always, reality finally caught up. The Kaiser who needed a cover story wandered through the Habsburgs and their carefully staged portraits. And now it's time to head north, into the grand and rather short-lived German Empire. Here we find one of history's loudest emperors, Kaiser Wilhelm II. He ruled Germany from 1888 until his abdication in 1918. And he spent much of that time building ships, rattling sabers, and generally pretending he was the smartest man in any room. Of course, he wasn't. But the entire imperial system depended on covering that up. A birth that wasn't quite right. Let's start at the beginning. Wilhelm was born in 1859 to Victoria, the Princess Royal of Britain, daughter of Queen Victoria and Prince Frederick of Prussia. On paper, this was the ultimate dynastic match. Britain's prestige meets Prussia's military strength. But from the start, Wilhelm was a disappointment. His birth was traumatic, and his left arm was permanently withered about 6 inches shorter than his right. Now, this wasn't the end of the world. Plenty of people lived perfectly normal lives with disabilities. But in 19th century Prussia, where the cult of military perfection reigned supreme, this was seen as catastrophic, and so began the first cover-up. Wilhelm's disability was downplayed, hidden in portraits, and excused as a minor inconvenience. In truth, it shaped his entire personality. He overcompensated, grew aggressive, and developed a lifelong need to prove himself as the most manly man in Europe. Mummy issues. Royal edition. Wilhelm's mother, Princess Victoria, had grown up in the liberal atmosphere of the British court. She believed in constitutional monarchy, progress, and reason. Her son, not so much. Wilhelm resented her constant criticism and her attempts to push him toward British-style politics. Their relationship soured early, and he spent much of his adult life railing against Britain, partly just to spite her. The public story was that Wilhelm adored his grandmother, Queen Victoria, and respected his British ties. The truth was a lot messier. His letters are full of bitterness, his speeches bristled with anti-British jabs, and he spent decades trying to build a navy specifically to rival his cousins across the Channel. The cover-up here wasn't just familial, it was dynastic. The German court desperately tried to present Wilhelm as a proud descendant of Queen Victoria, even while he was busy sabotaging that connection out of spite. 3 emperors in 1 year. Wilhelm's road to power came suddenly. In 1888, the so-called year of the 3 emperors, his grandfather, Kaiser Wilhelm I, died. His father, Frederick III, reigned for just 99 days before succumbing to throat cancer. And then Wilhelm II inherited the throne. The official line was that this was destiny. A young, energetic Kaiser to lead Germany into the future. But behind the scenes, Wilhelm's father had been the liberal hope of Germany, a man who admired British democracy and intended to reform the empire. His early death left Wilhelm free to take things in a much more authoritarian, militaristic direction. The court's spin machine went into overdrive. Wilhelm wasn't just an accident of succession, they insisted. He was the rightful, strong, God-given leader, the truth. He was a 29-year-old with a fragile ego and a talent for alienating allies. The Kaiser and his navy, one of Wilhelm's biggest obsessions, was the German navy. He was fascinated by ships and deeply jealous of Britain's Royal Navy, which, at the time, was the largest in the world. So, naturally, he decided Germany needed one just like it. The problem was that Germany didn't need a massive navy. It was a land power bordered by hostile neighbors, and its real strength was in its army. But Wilhelm insisted, and his advisors covered for him. They spun it as modernization, as prestige, as destiny. In reality, the naval buildup was one of the main reasons Britain and Germany became rivals, setting the stage for World War I and Wilhelm himself. He loved to pose in naval uniforms, strutting around like an admiral, despite never commanding anything more dangerous than a pen. The photos and parades made him look like Neptune reborn. The reality was just cosplay. The blabbermouth Kaiser's biggest weakness wasn't ships, though was his mouth. He had a habit of saying out loud the sorts of things most rulers wisely keep private. In 1908, he gave an interview to the Daily Telegraph in Britain, where he rambled about how much he loved the British people, but how jealous he was of their navy, and how ungrateful they were for all the times he'd saved them in crises. The article was a disaster. Germans were horrified at his lack of self-control. Britons were annoyed at his arrogance. The cover-up machine worked overtime to blame the press, to downplay his words, to insist the Kaiser had simply been misunderstood. But the truth was obvious. Wilhelm couldn't stop talking. He was insecure, needy, and reckless with his public. Image, Cousins at Warby, 1914. Wilhelm's fragile ego had brought him to the edge of disaster. His cousins ruled Britain and Russia, George V and Nicholas II. Then technically, they were all on friendly terms. They exchanged letters, called each other by nicknames, and posed for family portraits that made it look like Europe was one big family barbecue. The cover-up. That those cousinly ties actually mattered when Austria declared war on Serbia and Russia began mobilizing. Wilhelm's web of family connections did nothing to stop the slide into World War I instead. Germany plunged into the conflict, convinced it was destined for glory. Wilhelm presented himself as the supreme warlord, the fearless commander of his people. In truth, he spent much of the war sidelined by his generals, making speeches and signing papers, while others made the real decisions. The fall of the Kaiser by 1918, the illusion finally cracked. Germany was exhausted, starving, and defeated. Revolution broke out, and Wilhelm was forced to abdicate. The official line at first was that he had stepped aside to save Germany. The truth, he fled to the Netherlands, where he spent the rest of his life sulking in exile. In his memoirs, Wilhelm claimed he had been betrayed by his generals, by his people, by everyone. He took no responsibility as usual. The German monarchy was gone, and he was left with nothing but self-pity and a large collection of wood to chop on his estate, Wilhelm's. Legacy of cover-ups. Wilhelm II's entire reign was one long act of spin. His disability was hidden. His insecurities were glossed over. His reckless words were explained away. His failures in war were shifted onto others. The empire presented him as a strong leader, a modernizer, a naval genius, a warlord. In reality, he was insecure, impulsive, and disastrously out of his depth. And perhaps the greatest cover-up of all is that Wilhelm isn't always remembered as the man who helped start World War I, because compared to what came after the Nazis, the destruction, the Holocaust's reign, almost looks quaint. But make no mistake, without Wilhelm's ego and the empire's cover-ups, the 20th century might have looked very different indeed. Queen Victoria's family, circus so far. We've dealt with inbred emperors, jawline disasters, and Wilhelm's cosplay navy. But if you really want the masterclass in royal cover-ups, you always end up back at Queen Victoria. Because Queen Victoria wasn't just a monarch. She was the human version of dynastic superglue. Her children and grandchildren were sprinkled over European thrones like decorative confetti, which sounds impressive, until you remember that dynastic confetti tends to come with family baggage, genetic conditions, and a lot of passive-aggressive correspondence. Victoria's public image, the steady grandmother of Europe, the rock of stability, the black-clad widow mourning her beloved Albert. The reality. She micromanaged her children, sulked through half her reign, and presided over a family tree so tangled that entire wars broke out between her descendants. But let's drift slowly through the drawing room, one child at a time. The heir who wasn't quite up to it first, up Edward, the Prince of Wales. Later King Edward VII. Now, Edward had a reputation from the start. He wasn't studious. He wasn't disciplined. He was, frankly, lazy. Victoria and Albert despaired of him. They wanted another intellectual reformer like themselves, a philosopher king. Instead, they got Bertie, who preferred horses, women, and long dinners. Victoria covered this up the only way she knew how, by controlling him. She kept him out of politics, scolded him endlessly, and tried to paint him as irresponsible rather than genuinely incompetent. When Albert died in 1861, after rushing to scold Bertie for one of his affairs, Victoria blamed her son for killing his father with stress. That's right, the official family story was that Bertie's lack of morals had literally put Albert in his grave. Bertie spent decades as heir apparent, sidelined and infantilized. By the time he finally inherited the throne in 1901, he was already in his 60s. The cover-up here was simple. The public got a narrative of a frivolous prince who matured into a wise king. The truth was that he was always a bit frivolous, and it was just everyone else's exhaustion that made him seem competent by comparison. The favorite child, who died young then, there was Princess Alice. Alice was Victoria's second daughter, and in many ways, the most like Albert, serious, thoughtful, deeply earnest. She married Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse, and went off to Germany. She also carried something invisible, the gene for hemophilia. This was the disease that haunted Victoria's dynasty. It caused blood not to clot properly, making even minor injuries life-threatening. Alice passed it to several of her children, including her son Friedrich, who died after a fall, and her daughter Alex, who would later marry Tsar Nicholas II and carry the disease into the Russian imperial family. The official line was that Alice was a devoted wife and mother, tragically lost to diphtheria in 1878. The truth: she was the genetic pipeline that doomed the Romanovs' only heir, Tsarevich Alexei. And because the Victorians didn't yet understand recessive inheritance, the palace worked hard to downplay any suggestion that the royal family itself might be the source of this creeping weakness. The liberal experiment that failed next, Princess Victorian, known as Vicky, the eldest child, and perhaps the one Victoria most pinned her hopes on. Vicky married Frederick of Prussia, the liberal prince we met in part 6, who lasted only 99 days as Kaiser before dying of throat cancer. Together, they were supposed to turn Prussia into a more enlightened, constitutional monarchy. Instead, their son was Wilhelm II, the insecure Kaiser with the withered arm and a knack for bluster. The cover-up here is almost Shakespearean. Publicly, Vicky was portrayed as the wise British princess civilizing the Prussians. Privately, she was alienated, criticized by the Prussian court, and blamed by her son for everything that went wrong in his life. History books often glide past the dysfunction. But if you connect the dots, the whole grandmother of Europe image suddenly looks more like grandmother of catastrophes. The genetic curse continues back in Britain. Another of Victoria's daughters, Princess Beatrice, carried haemophilia forward yet again. She passed it into the Spanish royal family, where her son Alfonso also suffered from the disease. At this point, the cover-up wasn't just family gossip, it was state policy. Any mention of haemophilia in royal lines was softened, hidden, or explained away. Doctors were discreet. Courtiers pretended accidents were just accidents, because admitting that the House of Windsor, Saxe-Coburg, and Gotha, as they were still known, was riddled with a deadly genetic condition might weaken the dynasty. This is why Victoria is sometimes nicknamed the grandmother of Europe with an asterisk. Yes, she spread her descendants across the continent, but she also spread haemophilia, which quietly undermined more than one throne. Victoria herself, but what about Victoria personally? Her cover-ups were as much about mood as politics. After Albert's death, she retreated from public life, dressing in black, hiding in Balmoral, and refusing to appear at state events. The British government had to scramble to maintain her image, presenting her as a devoted widow rather than, say, a queen neglecting her duties. She also had her share of rumours, most notably about her close relationship with her Scottish servant, John Brown. The palace worked overtime to dismiss any hint of impropriety, even though Victoria leaned on him emotionally for decades. Later, the same happened with her Indian attendant, Abdul Karim, whom she elevated to a position of intimacy that shocked her family. Both men were scrubbed from the official record as much as possible, so the official Victoria was the embodiment of virtue and mourning. The real Victoria was lonely, controlling, and oddly dependent on the affection of servants she trusted more than her own children. A family that ate itself by the early 20th century. Victoria's descendants were everywhere, ruling Britain, Germany, Russia, Spain, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Greece. Practically every throne had her blood in it. The official image was that this would bring peace, that being cousins would prevent wars. The truth was the opposite. Rivalries deepened, alliances clashed, and when war finally broke out in 1914, Victoria's grandchildren were on opposite sides of the battlefield. The ultimate cover-up. That dynastic marriages could somehow fix Europe. They didn't. They made the wars more personal, more bitter, and in the case of Russia, more tragic. Because thanks to Victoria's granddaughter, Alex, and that haemophilia gene, the Romanovs turned to a wandering mystic named Rasputin to heal their heir. That desperation eroded what little trust remained in the Tsarist system, pushing Russia toward revolution. Victoria's carefully managed afterlife when Victoria died in 1901, the narrative was ready. She was the great matriarch, the symbol of stability. the longest reigning monarch in British history at the time. Her decades of retreat from public life, her family scandals, her genetic legacies, they were brushed aside. Instead, the story was that she had presided over a golden age of empire. Even her funeral was choreographed as a spectacle of unity, attended by dozens of kings, queens, and princes. Never mind that half of them would soon be at war with each other. The cover-up was complete. Victoria was remembered not for the chaos she sowed, but for the illusion of order she embodied. Floating onwards, so there you have it. Queen Victoria. Grandmother, genetic time bomb, master of selective appearances. Her dynasty looked like a symbol of unity, but was actually a web of dysfunction, disease, and denial. And yet the cover-ups worked so well that even now, when people hear Victorian, they think of lace, manners, and prudish respectability, not bloody bandages, political spite, and cousin wars. But if you think the Victorians were experts at hiding their cracks, wait until you see what their 20th century descendants got up to. Because next, we're gliding gently into the British, the royal family of the 1900s, a family that changed its name, reinvented its image, and tried very hard to make us forget they were basically Germans in fancy hats. The Windsors invent themselves by the early 1900s. The British royal family had a bit of a problem. They weren't actually the Windsors yet. They were still the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, which sounds fine if you're a small German duchy, but it doesn't exactly scream rule Britannia. And then came World War I. Suddenly, Britain found itself locked in a bitter, bloody struggle against Germany. And the British royal family had a German name, a German identity, and, awkwardly, a lot of German relatives. The cover-up, reinvent. The brand, George V. The reluctant rebrander in the throne at this time was George V. George wasn't supposed to be king. He was the spare, not the heir. His elder brother, Prince Albert Victor, was meant to inherit. But Albert Victor died suddenly of pneumonia in 1892, after a life mostly remembered for being, well, not particularly bright. Some even whispered about scandalous behavior, though the palace worked hard to smooth that over. So George stepped in, and what kind of king was he? Dull, dutiful, reliable. He collected stamps. He wore tweed. He was, essentially, a human cardigan. But that was exactly what Britain needed. Someone who didn't stand out too much. Someone who embodied stability. While the empire was wobbling, and when the war made his German ties embarrassing, George rebranded. In 1917, he declared that the royal family would no longer be the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. They would be the House of Windsor, because Windsor Castle sounded reassuringly English, and also conveniently avoided the fact that their bloodline was about as German as sauerkraut. It worked. Overnight, the dynasty's image shifted. The German cousins became a quiet embarrassment. Letters were burned, connections downplayed, names anglicized. Even Prince Louis of Battenberg, another German relative, was transformed into the Marquis of Milford Haven, because nothing says totally British like Milford Haven. The cousins at war, of course. The name change couldn't disguise the awkward family drama, because over in Germany, the Kaiser Wilhelm II was George V's first cousin. And over in Russia, Tsar Nicholas II was another cousin. The three men even looked eerily alike, with their matching beards and family features. They could have been mistaken for brothers in a lineup. During World War I, propaganda portrayed Wilhelm as the monster, the Hun, the enemy of civilization. and George was positioned as the patriotic king defending Britain. But in private, it was messier. George wrestled with the fact that he was at war with his own relatives, and the ultimate scandal came in 1917 during the Russian Revolution. Tsar Nicholas and his family were under threat. The British government floated the idea of offering them asylum, but George, after some hesitation, said no. He worried that bringing the unpopular Romanovs to Britain might destabilize his own shaky position, so the offer was withdrawn. And soon after, the Romanovs were executed in Ekaterinburg. The cover-up that George had done all he could, but circumstances made rescue impossible. The truth. He chose his own stability over his cousin's survival. The roaring heir next in line was George's eldest son, Edward, Prince of Wales, the man who would one day be Edward VIII. Edward was handsome, charismatic, and adored by the public. He toured. The empire shook hands and played the part of a modern prince. On the surface, he was everything the monarchy needed to stay relevant in the 1920s. But beneath the surface, he was restless, self-indulgent, and frankly not that interested in the actual job. He preferred parties, fashion, and, above all, women, married women, to be precise. The palace worked overtime to cover this up, ensuring the newspapers never printed the details. For the public, he remained the charming bachelor prince. For those in the know, he was a walking scandal waiting to happen, and then, of course, it did happen. But we'll drift to that in a moment. The stammering spare meanwhile. Edward's younger brother, Albert, known to his family as Bertie, was the quieter, awkward sibling. He had a stammer, crippling shyness, and little expectation of ever wearing the crown. He preferred a quiet life with his wife, Elizabeth Bodleian, later known as the Queen Mother. Together, they raised two daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret. The cover-up here was subtler. Bertie's difficulties were hidden, minimized, softened. The public saw him as dutiful, perhaps a bit reserved, but never as someone struggling with speech, confidence, and health. That vulnerability was carefully concealed behind the image of a supportive family man. Little did anyone know that this man, not his glamorous brother, would end up carrying the crown through the darkest years of Britain's modern history. Edward VIII and the abdication crisis. And so we arrive at the big royal scandal of the 1930s. Edward VIII ascended the throne in January 1936, and by December of that same year, he had abdicated. The reason: Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, twice divorced in fact, and still married when their affair began. The British government, the Church of England, and much of the establishment said no. A king could not marry a woman and remain head of the church. Edward's choice was blunt: throne or Wallis. He chose Wallis. Publicly, it was framed as a great love story, the man who gave up a kingdom for the woman he loved. In reality, it was also about Edward's unwillingness to do the job of being king, and the establishment's fear of his political sympathies. Because Edward had another problem. He admired Hitler. During the 1930s, Edward made comments sympathetic to fascism. He visited Germany. He met Hitler. He believed appeasement was the way forward. And though this was hushed up at the time, later evidence suggests he was far more compromised than the monarchy ever wanted to admit. The cover-up here was massive. The abdication was spun as romance, not politics. The pro-fascist sympathies were swept under the rug. Even decades later, documentaries softened the edges, because the idea that a British king might have leaned toward Hitler. That was not a bedtime story the public was supposed to hear. George VI, the unlikely King Anso. After Edward stepped down, the crown fell onto Bertie's reluctant head. George VI was never meant to be king. He was nervous, reserved, plagued by his stammer, but with his wife Elizabeth by his side, he grew into the role. During World War II, he became a symbol of resilience. He refused to leave London during the Blitz. He visited bombed neighborhoods. He stood alongside his people. The official image was simple: the shy king who overcame his difficulties to inspire a nation. And it wasn't entirely false. But what was covered up was the sheer strain it put on him. The smoking, the stress, the declining health. By the time the war was over, George was already a man worn down, his body failing. When he died in 1952, at the age of just 56, it was painted as a sudden, tragic loss. In reality, years of chain smoking and the relentless pressure of kingship had been eating away at him. And enter Elizabeth, which brings us, softly, to a young woman stepping off a plane in 1952. Princess Elizabeth, suddenly queen at the age of 20-5. Her reign would become the longest in British history. A masterclass in image management, and one of the most polished cover-ups of all. But we'll glide into that royal balancing act in the next part. So there you have it. The birth of the Windsors, a name change, a cousin sacrificed, a king who loved Hitler, and a shy, stammering man who steadied the ship. The public saw romance, stability, and duty. Behind the curtain was fear, scandal, and more than a little selective editing, because the greatest cover-up wasn't just about one secret. It was about reinventing an entire dynasty, over and over again, until people forgot the cracks underneath. The Windsors invent themselves by the early 1900s. The British royal family had a bit of a problem. They weren't actually the Windsors yet. They were still the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, which sounds fine if you're a small German duchy, but it doesn't exactly scream Rule Britannia. And then came World War I. Suddenly, Britain found itself locked in a bitter, bloody struggle against Germany, and the British royal family had a German name, a German identity, and, awkwardly, a lot of German relatives. The cover-up, reinvent. The brand, George V. The reluctant rebrander in the throne at this time was George V. George wasn't supposed to be king. He was the spare, not the heir. His elder brother, Prince Albert Victor, was meant to inherit. But Albert Victor died suddenly of pneumonia in 1892, after a life mostly remembered for being, well, not particularly bright. Some even whispered about scandalous behavior, though the palace worked hard to smooth that over. So George stepped in, and what kind of king was he? Dull, dutiful, reliable. He collected stamps. He wore tweed. He was, essentially, a human cardigan. But that was exactly what Britain needed. Someone who didn't stand out too much. Someone who embodied stability. While the empire was wobbling, and when the war made his German ties embarrassing, George rebranded. In 1917, he declared that the royal family would no longer be the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. They would be the House of Windsor, because Windsor Castle sounded reassuringly English, and also conveniently avoided the fact that their bloodline was about as German as sauerkraut. It worked. Overnight, the dynasty's image shifted. The German cousins became a quiet embarrassment. Letters were burned, connections downplayed, names anglicized. Even Prince Louis of Battenberg, another German relative, was transformed into the Marquis of Milford Haven. because nothing says totally British like Milford Haven. The cousins at war, of course. The name change couldn't disguise the awkward family drama, because over in Germany, the Kaiser Wilhelm II was George V's first cousin. And over in Russia, Tsar Nicholas II was another cousin. The three men even looked eerily alike, with their matching beards and family features. They could have been mistaken for brothers in a lineup. During World War I, propaganda portrayed Wilhelm as the monster, the Hun, the enemy of civilization. And George was positioned as the patriotic king defending Britain. But in private, it was messier. George wrestled with the fact that he was at war with his own relatives. And the ultimate scandal came in 1917 during the Russian Revolution. Tsar Nicholas and his family were under threat. The British government floated the idea of offering them asylum. But George, after some hesitation, said no. He worried that bringing the unpopular Romanovs to Britain might destabilize his own shaky position, so the offer was withdrawn. And soon after, the Romanovs were executed in Ekaterinburg. The cover-up that George had done all he could, but circumstances made rescue impossible. The truth. He chose his own stability over his cousin's survival. The roaring heir next in line was George's eldest son, Edward, Prince of Wales, the man who would one day be Edward VIII. Edward was handsome, charismatic, and adored by the public. He toured. The empire shook hands and played the part of a modern prince. On the surface, he was everything the monarchy needed to stay relevant in the 1920s. But beneath the surface, he was restless, self-indulgent, and frankly not that interested in the actual job. He preferred parties, fashion, and, above all, women, married women, to be precise. The palace worked overtime to cover this up, ensuring the newspapers never printed the details. For the public, he remained the charming bachelor prince. For those in the know, he was a walking scandal waiting to happen, and then, of course, it did happen. But we'll drift to that in a moment. The stammering spare meanwhile. Edward's younger brother, Albert, known to his family as Bertie, was the quieter, awkward sibling. He had a stammer, crippling shyness, and little expectation of ever wearing the crown. He preferred a quiet life with his wife, Elizabeth Bosleyan, later known as the Queen Mother. Together, they raised two daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret. The cover-up here was subtler. Bertie's difficulties were hidden, minimized, softened. The public saw him as dutiful, perhaps a bit reserved, but never as someone struggling with speech, confidence, and health. That vulnerability was carefully concealed behind the image of a supportive family man. Little did anyone know that this man, not his glamorous brother, would end up carrying the crown through the darkest years of Britain's modern history. Edward VIII and the abdication crisis. And so we arrive at the big royal scandal of the 1930s. Edward VIII ascended the throne in January 1936, and by December of that same year, he had abdicated. The reason: Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, twice divorced in fact, and still married when their affair began. The British government, the Church of England, and much of the establishment said no. A king could not marry a woman and remain head of the church. Edward's choice was blunt: throne or Wallis. He chose Wallis. Publicly, it was framed as a great love story, the man who gave up a kingdom for the woman he loved. In reality, it was also about Edward's unwillingness to do the job of being king, and the establishment's fear of his political sympathies.